The air in the Costa Rican rainforest was so thick you could almost drink it. It hung heavy on the skin, a warm, wet blanket that smelled of damp earth, sweet rotting leaves, and 1,000 unseen flowers. For Dr. Elena Rostova, this scent was the perfume of discovery. She had been coming to places like this for over 20 years, and the feeling of being completely surrounded by life, in every direction and at every level, never got old. It was a chaotic symphony, and she was one of its most devoted listeners, her boots worn and caked with the mud of a dozen different countries, sank softly into the rich soil as she pushed aside a giant fan-like leaf. Behind her, the small team followed in a ragged line, their energy levels already flagging despite the early hour. At the back of the group, Ben Carter was trying to pretend he wasn't struggling. He was young, one of the brightest graduate students Elena had ever taken under her wing. But his brilliance was matched only by his impatience. For him, the trek wasn't a symphony. It was an obstacle course. He saw the jungle not as a living wonder, but as a barrier between him and the data he craved. He swatted at a mosquito that buzzed near his ear, his movements sharp and annoyed. He was here to find a specific, undocumented species of poison dart frog, a tiny jewel of a creature that had only been mentioned in the whispered legends of the local people. To Ben, everything else was just green noise. He wanted the prize, and he wanted it now. Leading them was Carlos, a man whose family had lived in the shadow of the Corcovado National Park for generations. He moved through the dense undergrowth with an impossible grace, his worn-out sneakers making no sound on the forest floor. He didn't need a map or a compass. The jungle was his map, his home. He carried a machete, but he used it sparingly, preferring to find the natural paths in the tangle of vines and roots. He had a quiet, watchful face, and his eyes missed nothing. He felt the team's restlessness, especially the young man's, and it worried him. The jungle did not reward impatience. It punished it. They had been walking for hours, the heat rising as the sun climbed higher, when Carlos suddenly stopped. He held up a single hand, a gesture so firm and unexpected that the entire team froze in their tracks. Elena moved up to stand beside him, her senses on high alert. "What is it, Carlos?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. "Is it the frog?" Carlos didn't answer right away. He was staring straight ahead, his brow furrowed. He pointed the machete, not at an animal, but at the ground in front of them. Elena followed his gaze and saw what had caught his attention. It wasn't an animal track or a rare plant. It was a stone. A flat-cut stone, almost perfectly square, peeking out from beneath a carpet of moss and fallen leaves. It was the kind of thing that had no business being there, miles from any known settlement or road. It was a sign. With a new sense of caution, Carlos began to clear away the foliage. As he worked, more stones were revealed, forming a path. It wasn't a grand highway, just a series of simple, fitted stones leading deeper into the forest, away from the river they had been following. The air seemed to change as they walked along the path. The jungle sounds grew quieter, more distant. The light, already dappled by the high canopy, seemed to dim further, as if they were walking into a natural twilight. Ben felt a shiver of excitement run down his spine, displacing the fatigue. This was it. This was the kind of thing he had dreamed of. Not just a new species, but a new mystery. The path ended in a small circular clearing. The trees here were older, their branches intertwining high above to form a dense green ceiling. In the center of the clearing was a structure. It wasn't a temple or a tomb, but a simple low platform made of the same dark, weathered stone as the path. It was maybe 3 feet high and 10 feet across, covered in a thick layer of moss and vines. It looked ancient, impossibly old, as if it had grown out of the earth itself. And there, resting right in the middle of the platform, was the reason Carlos had stopped. It was a rock, a geode about the size of a large grapefruit, but it was like no geode any of them had ever seen. The outer shell was a dull, pitted gray, but it was cracked open, revealing the crystals within. And those crystals were wrong. They didn't sparkle. They didn't catch the faint light of the clearing. Instead, they seemed to drink it. The interior of the geode was a pocket of absolute, perfect blackness. It's a hole in the world that was so deep it made your eyes ache to look at it. It didn't reflect anything. It absorbed everything. The air around it felt still and cold, a tiny pocket of winter in the heart of the humid jungle. The team gathered around the platform, their scientific curiosity warring with a primal sense of unease. They were all experts in their fields: biology, geology, archaeology, but none of them had a frame of reference for this. It was an anomaly. It was impossible. Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. This place felt sacred, but in a dangerous, untouchable way. She watched as Ben edged closer, his eyes wide with a feverish kind of wonder. He was drawn to it, she could see that. He saw a puzzle to be solved, a discovery to be claimed. He didn't feel the danger. He only felt the thrill of the unknown. And in that moment, looking at the dark, silent stone and the young man who was so captivated by it, Alina knew that this expedition had just become about something much more than a frog. The silence in the clearing was a physical thing. It pressed in on them from all sides, a heavy blanket that muffled the usual cacophony of the jungle. The team stood around the low stone platform, their faces a mixture of awe and unease. For people who spent their lives classifying and understanding the world, this was a deeply unsettling moment. The geode sat in its center, a perfect void, a hole punched in the fabric of reality. It seemed to pull the light and the sound right out of the air, leaving a pocket of nothingness in its wake. It was Carlos who broke the spell. He took a hesitant step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the small leather pouch he wore around his neck. His face, usually calm and open, was now a mask of serious concern. He began to speak, his voice low and urgent, a rapid flow of Spanish that was laced with a reverence the others had never heard from him before. Alina listened intently.
Ow.
Her brow furrowed. When he finished, she turned to the team, her own voice hushed and solemn. He says this place has a name. His people call it the Lugar del Susurro Quieto, the place of the quiet whisper. She paused, looking back at the stone. And that, she said, pointing with her chin, is the Pedra del Silencio, the stone of silence. One of the other students, a young woman specializing in geology, shifted her weight nervously. The stone of silence? What does that mean? Alina translated Carlos's next words carefully. He says it's a very old story, from before his grandparents' grandparents. It's not a rock, not really. He says it's a sleeping thing, a listener. It absorbs the sounds of the forest, the voices of the animals, the whispers of the wind, and it holds them. It keeps the balance. Carlos spoke again, his gestures becoming more emphatic. He pointed at the geode and then made a sharp pulling motion towards his own chest. He says it sleeps, Alina continued, and it must not be woken up. To touch it is to disturb its sleep. It's disrespectful and dangerous. Quiet chill ran down Ben's spine, but it was mixed with a thrilling current of excitement. A sleeping thing? A listener. This was better than any legend. This was real. He watched as Carlos crossed himself, a gesture of pure, unadulterated fear. The guide's eyes were fixed on the stone, and for the first time since they had met him, he looked truly afraid. Alina, ever the scientist, stepped forward to bring the conversation back to the world of logic and reason. All right, everyone, let's be clear, she said, her voice taking on the firm, no-nonsense tone she used in her lectures. We respect Carlos's beliefs and the traditions of his people. That is rule number one out here. But we also respect the scientific method. She looked at each of them, her gaze lingering on Ben for just a second longer than the others. We have no idea what we're looking at. The crystalline structure is unlike anything I've ever seen. The lack of light reflection is anomalous. That surface could be covered in a unique microbial life, a fungus, or a mineral that is toxic to the touch. Our skin oils could permanently contaminate it, ruining any chance we have of studying it properly. She walked over to the equipment packs and started pulling out cases. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up a perimeter. We'll use long-range lenses for photography, spectrometers to analyze the light it's not reflecting, and environmental sensors to check for any radiation or unusual energy fields. We document. We observe. We do not interact. Is that understood? She looked around the circle of faces. They all nodded. Ben, she said, her voice softening just a little, I know how your mind works. I know you're curious. But I'm asking you, as your mentor, to please be careful. Do not touch it. Understood? Ben swallowed hard and gave a quick nod. Yeah, understood. No touching. He tried to sound casual, but his heart was thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could feel the weight of her stare, and it made him feel like a child being told not to touch a hot stove. But this wasn't a stove. This was a mystery, a riddle carved from the bones of the earth. And he had always been terrible at leaving riddles unsolved. The team sprang into action. The familiar routine of setting up their equipment, a welcome distraction from the oppressive silence of the clearing. They assembled tripods, calibrated delicate instruments, and ran data cables. Their quiet professional chatter, a stark contrast to the stillness of the stone. But Ben couldn't focus. He was supposed to be helping to set up the atmospheric sensors. But his eyes kept drifting back to the god. It was just a rock, he told himself. A weird one, sure, but still just a rock. Carlos's stories were just that, stories. Local folklore designed to keep people away from a sacred place. And Elena's warnings were just standard protocol, the kind of thing she had to say. She was being overly cautious. What was the worst that could happen? A skin rash. He laughed to himself. He felt an almost magnetic pull towards the platform. It was a physical itch in the palm of his hand, a deep, nagging curiosity that demanded to be satisfied. He started to rationalize it. What if it was cold? Or strangely warm? What if the surface wasn't smooth like it looked, but had a texture, a pattern you could only feel? He could be the first person in centuries to know. He could just walk over, tap it with his fingertip, and walk away. 1 second? It would take less than a second. Who would even know? It wouldn't hurt the stone. It wouldn't contaminate anything. It was for science, really. A little bit of hands-on, empirical data. That's all. He watched Elena, who was now hunched over a laptop, her back to him. The other 2 students were busy arguing over the correct settings for the spectrometer. Carlos was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking out into the jungle, as if he were standing guard. No one was watching. The path to the stone was clear. It seemed to be calling to him, a silent, dark invitation. The warnings echoed in his head, but they were starting to sound distant, muffled, like they were coming from another room. All he could hear now was the pounding of his own heart and the quiet, seductive whisper of the stone. The rationalizations were a runaway train in Ben's mind. Each one chugged along the tracks, gaining speed and momentum, making it easier and easier to ignore the flashing red lights of warning in his head. He was a scientist, wasn't he? Science was about observation, about empirical data. How could you truly observe something without interacting with it on some level? A photograph was just light. A spectrometer reading was just numbers. They were shadows of the real thing. To know the stone, he had to feel it. He told himself it was for the good of the discovery, a noble sacrifice of a rule for the sake of a greater truth. But deep down, beneath all the justifications, it was something simpler. It was the itch, the pure, undeniable human curiosity that had led people to sail off the edge of the map and to stare into the heart of volcanoes. He had to know. He watched Elena, her back still turned as she typed commands into her laptop. The soft clicking of the keys was the only sound in the clearing, a tiny, fragile rhythm in the vast silence. The other 2 researchers were now focused on a small screen, pointing at a graph and whispering to each other. Carlos was a statue at the edge of the trees, his gaze fixed on the world outside the clearing, a silent sentinel. This was his chance. It felt like the universe itself was holding its breath, creating a perfect window of opportunity just for him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. He took a slow, quiet breath, trying to steady his nerves, and then he took his first step. It felt like a monumental step, like he was crossing a line he could never uncross. The soft earth gave slightly under his boot, making no sound. He moved slowly, deliberately, placing one foot carefully in front of the other, as if the ground were made of thin ice. The 10 feet between him and the stone platform felt like a mile. With every step, the world around him seemed to fade away. The green of the jungle became a blur in his peripheral vision. The quiet whispers of his colleagues became indistinct murmurs, like the sound of a distant stream. All that mattered was the stone, the dark, silent void in the center of the platform. It seemed to grow larger as he approached, its blackness deepening, pulling him in. The air grew cooler, cleaner, and the heavy scent of the rainforest was replaced by a neutral, odorless void, like the air of a sealed tomb. He reached the edge of the platform. The stone was right there, an arm's length away. Up close, it was even more mesmerizing. The jagged edges of the broken shell were sharp and defined, but the interior was a perfect, smooth, featureless black. It didn't look like a crystal formation. It looked like a hole had been cut out of space itself. He could feel a strange energy coming from it, not heat or cold, but a kind of pressure, like the change in air pressure before a storm. He raised his hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked down at his own hand, at the lines on his palm, the tiny hairs on his skin, and then back at the perfect, unnatural blackness of the stone. This was it. There was no turning back. He stretched out his index finger, the tip of it hovering just a millimeter from the surface. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the image of Elena's stern face flashing in his mind. But the pull was too strong. He closed his eyes for a brief moment and then pushed his finger forward. The moment his skin made contact, the world vanished. There was no sensation of temperature or texture. It felt like touching nothing. It was as if his finger had simply ceased to exist where it met the stone. There was no solid surface, no resistance, just a complete and total void. A gasp caught in his throat. And then it happened. It started as a low, deep hum, vibration so low it wasn't heard with the ears, but felt in the bones of his skull and in the pit of his stomach. The air in the clearing seemed to suck inward, rushing towards the stone in a silent, invisible current. The hair on his arms and the back of his neck stood on end. And then everyone froze. Elena, who had just started to turn her head, her mouth open to say something, was locked in place. The other 2 students, mid-gesture, were like statues, their eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Even Carlos, who had begun to take a step back into the clearing, his hands raised in a gesture of warning, was frozen mid-stride. A fly that had been buzzing around Elena's laptop was suspended in midair, its wings perfectly still. The entire world had been put on pause. The only thing that moved was Ben. He was the center of this strange, silent hurricane. The silence that followed was not the quiet of the jungle. It was an absolute, profound, terrifying silence. It was the sound of a vacuum, the complete absence of any vibration, any life. The hum was gone. The breeze had stopped. The leaves on the trees were motionless. Ben could hear his own blood rushing in his ears, the frantic thumping of his own heart. A lonely, panicked drum solo in a dead world. He looked at his teammates, their faces frozen in masks of shock. He looked at the fly hanging in the air like a tiny, perfect sculpture. He looked at his finger, still pressed against the impossible blackness of the stone. It was Elena who broke the spell. Her body jolted as if an electric shock had passed through her. Her eyes, which had been wide with confusion, now filled with a sharp, pure panic. "Ben," she screamed, her voice raw and alien in the dead silence. "Step away now." The sound of her voice was like a key turning in a lock. The world crashed back into existence. The fly zipped away. The other students stumbled back, crying out in fear. Carlos shouted something in Spanish, a string of words that sounded like a prayer and a curse all at once. But Ben couldn't move. He was staring, transfixed, at his finger. The blackness of the geode was no longer just on the stone. It was on him. A dark, shadowy stain was creeping up his finger, spreading from the point of contact. It wasn't liquid. It was like his own flesh was being transformed, turning into the same matte, light-absorbing blackness as the stone. It moved slowly, deliberately, up past his first knuckle. A cold, sharp pain shot through his hand, a pain so intense it was blinding. The deep hum returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the stone. It was coming from him. The scream that tore from Elena's throat was a raw, jagged thing, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic that ripped through the suffocating silence. It was the catalyst that broke the world's strange stillness. For Ben, it was a lifeline, a jolt that snapped him out of his horrified trance. The pain in his finger was a white-hot fire, a cold, invading agony that felt like his very bones were being replaced with ice. With a guttural cry that was half pain and half terror, he ripped his hand away from the stone. The connection broke with a soundless snap. The deep, bone-vibrating hum that had been emanating from his own body ceased instantly, leaving a ringing emptiness in its wake. He stumbled backward, clutching his hand to his chest, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked down, his vision swimming with tears of pain. The creeping blackness had stopped. It had frozen in place, a stark, perfect line of darkness encircling his finger just past the first knuckle. The tip of his finger, the part that had touched the void, was no longer his own. It was a solid, matte black, like a piece of polished obsidian, utterly devoid of light and texture. It was dead, heavy, and completely, terrifyingly still. The rest of the team exploded into motion. The two other students scrambled away from the platform, tripping over roots and equipment in their desperate haste to put distance between themselves and the now tainted stone. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a fear that transcended logic. They were no longer scientists in a fascinating discovery. They were prey who had stumbled into a predator's den. Carlos was the only one who didn't run. He had taken a few steps back, but now he stood his ground, his face a canvas of ancient dread. He began to mutter in Spanish, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on Ben's transformed finger. "Lo desperdo," he whispered over and over, the words a horrified prayer. He woke it. His warnings, which had seemed like quaint local folklore just minutes before, now carried the terrifying weight of prophecy. Elena was a whirlwind of conflicted instincts. The scientist in her wanted to observe, to document, to understand. But the mentor, the human being in her, was screaming at the sight of her student's pain and the impossible thing happening to his hand. "Ben, let me see," she commanded, her voice shaking as she rushed towards him. She pulled a first aid kit from her pack, her hands fumbling with the latches. But as she got closer, she hesitated. What could she possibly do? Put antiseptic on a patch of living void? Bandage a finger that was no longer flesh and blood? "Stay back," Ben yelled, cradling his hand protectively. He didn't want her to touch it. He didn't want anyone to touch it. He could feel a wrongness radiating from the blackened fingertip, a coldness that seeped into the rest of his hand. It felt alien, a parasite that had latched onto him. The pain was subsiding, replaced by a profound numbness, but the sense of violation was growing stronger. He had done this. His impatience, his arrogance, had done this. "We have to go." Now, Elena's voice was sharp, cutting through the panic. Her decision-making skills, honed by years of crisis management in the field, finally kicked in. "This place is not safe. We leave everything. We go now." She started grabbing packs, shoving essential items into them. Water, a satellite phone, the medical kit, the expensive spectrometers, the cameras. The sample collection kits were all left behind, scattered on the forest floor like discarded toys. Their value was nothing compared to the potential danger. Carlos was already nodding vigorously, pointing back the way they came. "The forest is angry. The silence is broken. We must go." He didn't need to tell them twice. The team formed a clumsy, panicked huddle and fled the clearing, leaving the stone of silence to its quiet, watchful vigil. The run back through the jungle was a nightmare. The path that had seemed mysterious and intriguing on the way in was now a terrifying, tangled maze. Branches whipped at their faces. Roots threatened to trip them at every step. Ben stumbled along in a daze, cradling his injured hand. The black fingertip felt unnaturally heavy, a dead weight on the end of his arm. Every jolt and stumble sent a phantom ache through it, a memory of the pain. He could feel the eyes of his teammates on him, a mixture of pity, fear, and accusation. He was no longer one of them. He was the carrier of the curse, living proof of the danger, as they put distance between themselves and the clearing. The sounds of the rainforest began to return. It started as a distant hum, then slowly, tentatively, the chirps of insects and the calls of birds began to fill the air. But the sounds were no longer a comforting symphony of life. They sounded eerie, menacing, like the jungle was whispering about them, warning its other inhabitants of the tainted thing that ran through its paths. They didn't stop running until they burst through the tree line and into the small, open space of their base camp. They collapsed onto the ground, chests heaving, bodies covered in sweat and dirt. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were their desperate gasps for air and the distant, indifferent noise of the jungle. The adrenaline began to fade, and in its place came a cold, heavy reality. Finally, Alina knelt in front of Ben, her expression a mixture of guilt and grim determination. "Let me see it," she said softly, her voice gentle now. "Please." Slowly, reluctantly, Ben uncurled his fingers and held out his hand. In the dappled sunlight of the camp, the black fingertip was even more unsettling. It didn't look like a part of a living being. It was a perfect, seamless piece of darkness, absorbing the light around it. There was no line between his skin and the blackness. It was as if his flesh had simply decided to become something else. Alina reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers hovering just above it, afraid to make contact. She could feel no heat, no cold, just a strange, heavy stillness. The consequence was no longer a warning or a possibility. It was here, sitting at their campfire, a silent dark, permanent reminder of the second one of them touched what they shouldn't have. The night that followed was the longest of their lives. The small campfire they dared to build cast dancing. Nervous shadows on the faces of the team, but it couldn't seem to penetrate the heavy gloom that had settled over them. No one spoke much. What was there to say? The jungle, once a place of wonder and discovery, now felt like a prison, its unseen eyes watching them, judging them. The silence from the clearing had followed them back, not as an absence of sound, but as a presence. A cold spot in their collective memory that refused to thaw. Ben sat apart from the others. On a fallen log at the edge of the firelight, he couldn't stop looking at his hand. The black fingertip was a perfect, stark circle of nothingness in the flickering orange light. It didn't hurt anymore. The pain had been replaced by a profound and terrifying numbness. He could still move the finger, bend it at the joint. But it felt like he was talconed in a puppet's appendage, a foreign object attached to his body. It was heavier than it should have been, a tiny, dense weight that pulled at his hand, a constant physical reminder of his mistake. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the crackle of the fire or the distant hoot of an owl, but his awareness always circled back to that one small point of darkness. He had broken the world, and now he had to wear the piece he broke off. Alina was a storm of frantic energy and gnawing guilt. She paced back and forth, the satellite phone in her hand, feeling both like a lifeline and a lead weight. She was the leader. She was responsible. She had warned him, yes, but she had also brought him here, had fed his curiosity. It created the environment where his impatience could flourish. Every time she glanced at Ben, hunched and isolated, a fresh wave of shame washed over her. Her scientific mind, her entire worldview, had been shattered in that clearing. There were no charts, no graphs, no theories that could explain what had happened. It was magic, or curse, or something else entirely, something her education had no name for. And that was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. Finally, she could bear the waiting no longer. She walked a little ways from the camp, holding the phone up, searching for a signal. The others watched her, their silent, hopeful faces turned in her direction. After a few minutes of angling the device, she got a connection. The conversation she had was stilted and surreal. How do you describe this to a university administrator on the other side of the world? We have a situation, a biological incident. She tried to sound calm, professional, but her voice trembled. A team member has had contact with an unknown artifact. There's a localized transformation. The word felt clumsy and inadequate. She knew how it sounded. Crazy. But the fear in her voice must have been convincing enough. Promises were made. A team would be dispatched. A medical evacuation. But it would take time. They were, after all, in one of the most remote places on Earth. They had to wait. The waiting was its own form of torture. The next day, the team moved like ghosts around the camp. The other two students who had been so full of life and academic debate now avoided Ben. They wouldn't look at him. If he came near, they would find an excuse to move away. He was untouchable. He was the living evidence of their nightmare, and they couldn't bear to be near it. The isolation was a cold, sharp pain, almost worse than the initial agony in his finger. He was no longer Ben, the bright, impulsive grad student. He was the guy who touched the stone. Carlos, however, did not avoid him. The old guide would sit with him sometimes, not speaking, just sharing the space. He understood something the others didn't. On the second day, as they sat watching the river flow by, Carlos finally spoke. "The stone does not punish," he said, his voice quiet and raspy. "It balances. It takes a piece of the loud world and holds it quiet. You were loud. So it took a piece of your sound, your touch. It is not a curse. It is a trade." He looked at Ben's hand, not with fear, but with a deep, ancient sadness. "You will carry a piece of the silence with you now. Always." That afternoon, driven by a desperate need to understand, Ben decided to test his finger. He was alone, sitting by a patch of vibrant green ferns. Hesitantly, he reached out with his blackened fingertip and touched the delicate leaf of a fern. The moment contact was made, the leaf didn't burn or freeze. It simply lost its color. The vibrant green drained away, turning a brittle, lifeless brown, and then crumbling to dust in seconds. Ben snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence, the coldness, the wrongness, it wasn't just in him. It could come out. He could spread it. He buried his face in his hands, a wave of despair so powerful it almost broke him. Carlos was right. He was a carrier of the silence. 3 days after they fled the clearing, the sound came. A distant thumping, growing steadily louder. It was the sound of a helicopter. It should have been a sound of relief, of salvation. But as it grew closer, a new kind of dread settled over the camp. This wasn't a simple rescue. When the helicopter finally appeared over the canopy and descended into a nearby clearing, it was not followed by friendly medics. It was followed by people in white full-body hazmat suits. They moved with a stiff, impersonal efficiency, their faces hidden behind plastic visors. They didn't talk to the team. Not really. They asked questions into radios, their voices distorted and mechanical. They treated Ben not like an injured person, but like a contaminated specimen. They led him to a sealed, clear plastic tent, his movements slow and defeated. He looked back one last time at Alina, her face pale and etched with guilt. He looked at the jungle, the vast, green, living world that had almost swallowed him whole. He was leaving it, but he wasn't leaving it unchanged. As they strapped him into a stretcher inside the tent, he looked at his hand one more time. The black fingertip was a perfect, polished void, a tiny piece of the stone of silence that he would carry with him forever. He had touched what he shouldn't have, and in return it had touched him, leaving a silent, dark, and permanent mark. The world hadn't frozen for just a few seconds. For Ben, a part of it was frozen forever.